All right, so get that we're diving deep today into the story of Rod Blagojevich, governor of Illinois, who like went from releasing hostages in Yugoslavia
Mm.
to well, facing some serious legal trouble. And we're using the American Scandal podcast as our kind of guide here. And let me tell you, they really know how to tell a story.
Oh, yeah, they blend like archival audio with those dramatic recreations. It's so well done, you almost feel like you're right there in the thick of it all, you know?
It's
Yeah.
wild, right? And here's a little something that'll like really set the stage. Blagojevich, he pulled off this incredible thing, helping to free American hostages during the Kosovo War.
Yeah.
And get this, he even had a post office named after him.
Yeah.
It makes you think, like, how does someone go from that
Yeah.
to the scandals that like later just engulfed his entire career?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Like, what motivates someone to do both good, acts of public good even, and then get caught up in all this controversy? It says a lot about human ambition and how slippery that slip of power can be.
Okay, so let's rewind back to Blagojevich's early days. Picture this. Fresh out of law school, he marries Patty Mel and her father.
Yeah.
Well, he just happens to be a major player in Chicago politics.
Talk about a strategic alliance. That connection plus the fundraising skills of like a young David Axelrod back then
Right.
really launched Blagojevich's political career. I mean, it wasn't long before he landed a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives.
Not bad, eh? Not bad at all. But Blagojevich always seemed to be aiming higher. You know, he had his sights set on that Illinois governor's mansion, but he needed something big, something to really boost his name recognition. And that's where the 1999 Kosovo War comes in.
Yes, the capture of those 3 American soldiers, it created this huge international crisis. And Blagojevich, he saw an opportunity. He had Serbian heritage and connections in Yugoslavia, so he figured, why not try to use those to negotiate the hostages release? It was a bold move for sure, a calculated risk. It could have made him a hero.
Yeah.
Or totally blown up in his face.
Hold on, a Serbian-American guy negotiating with Yugoslavia. That's almost poetic.
It is, isn't it? And to make things even more interesting, Blagojevich knew he needed some serious support, so he reaches out to none other than Jesse Jackson Jr., hoping to get the diplomatic expertise of his father, the Reverend Jesse Jackson.
Oh, wow, the Reverend. Talk about star power. I can only imagine what that first meeting must have been like.
Well, the podcast describes it as kind of a clash of egos. Blagojevich, he's used to being the center of attention, and suddenly he finds himself totally overshadowed by the Reverend's charisma and his decades of experience on the world stage.
So Blagojevich is not exactly thrilled with this partnership.
Yeah.
I mean, I can see how that might bruise the ego a bit.
It definitely seems to have rattled him. The podcast plays this audio clip of Blagojevich remembering those early phone calls with the Reverend, and you can just hear the tension in his voice, almost like a sense of resentment simmering there.
Okay, so picture this. They land in Yugoslavia, cameras everywhere. They visit bomb-damaged areas. They meet with officials, and the whole thing is just super dramatic.
And then there's this incredible scene where they finally get to meet the hostages during an air raid. Talk about high stakes and intense pressure.
Wow, so they're literally in the middle of a war zone, trying to negotiate the release of these soldiers. That's like something straight out of a movie.
It really is. And in this scene, Reverend Jackson really takes center stage. He delivers this powerful plea to the Yugoslavian officials, refusing to leave until he sees all 3 soldiers safe and sound. He's just commanding, compassionate, a true force of nature.
Wait, so where's Blagojevich in all of this?
He's there, but definitely playing a supporting role. The podcast even describes this moment where they're all praying for the hostages release, and Blagojevich is literally out of the camera frame.
Oh, man, that must have stung. You got to wonder if that experience like planted a seed, this need to prove himself, to be the one in control, you know.
That's a fascinating insight. It's almost like a Shakespearean tragedy in the making, the ambitious understudy waiting in the wings, watching the master command the stage. Did that feeling of being sidelined fuel Blagojevich's hunger for power? It's hard to say for sure, but it certainly adds another layer to his motivations.
In the end, though, the mission is a success. The hostages are released, and Blagojevich does get some of that name recognition he was craving.
Right, but it came at a price. David Axelrod, his longtime advisor and friend, he started to question Blagojevich's motives. He saw this growing ambition, this almost like insatiable thirst for power, and he wondered if it was truly rooted in public service or something more self-serving.
So their relationship starts to crack. I could see how that would create some tension.
Absolutely. It all comes to a head in this incredibly tense meeting between Blagojevich and Axelrod. Axelrod flat out asks, "Why do you want to be governor?" And Blagojevich just can't articulate a clear answer.
Wait, he just goes silent. That's telling.
It is, isn't it? Here's Axelrod, who'd been with him from the start, the architect of his early success. And he's sensing something is off, this lack of a genuine why behind Blagojevich's ambition. It was a deal breaker for Axelrod. He decided to walk away.
Wow, talk about a turning point. I bet that stung for Blagojevich. Being abandoned by his closest advisor like that?
It did, and it seems to have fueled his determination even more. He jumps headfirst into that 2002 gubernatorial race, facing a tough Republican opponent. In a state that hadn't elected a Democratic governor in decades, the odds were stacked against him. But Blagojevich thrived on proving his doubters wrong.
So Axelrod's out of the picture. And Blagojevich has got to navigate this tough campaign. Without his longtime advisor, I imagine that created a bit of a void, right?
It did, and into that void stepped Tony Resko, a wealthy businessman with a reputation for being, well, shall we say, persuasive. He became Blagojevich's new right-hand man, taking charge of fundraising and strategy.
Okay, so Resko's the new Axelrod. Except I'm getting the sense they had very different styles. The podcast kind of hints that Resko wasn't afraid to bend the rules a bit.
That's putting it mildly. Remember, Blagojevich campaigned on this whole clean up Illinois politics platform. But with Resko calling the shots, things took a very different turn.
What do you mean? Give me some examples.
Well, the podcast describes these incredibly aggressive fundraising tactics. Apparently, Blagojevich himself would put immense pressure on potential donors, sometimes even resorting to what some might call bullying to get those contributions.
Wait, the governor himself. That seems a bit, well, hands-on for a guy who's supposed to be running the state.
Exactly. And this is where it gets really interesting, because it wasn't just about raising money. It was about creating this whole system of favors. And to use the Latin term quid pro quo, which basically means this for that, a favor for a favor.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this whole thing gets so tangled. But how does it actually play out? Paint me a picture.
All right, let's take the case of Ali Abba, a successful engineer who got caught up in a post-9/11 FBI investigation. Just because he had a similar name to someone on a watch list, it cost him his job and really tarnished his reputation. He saw getting involved in politics as a way to restore his good name. And, well, Resko saw an opportunity.
I'm sensing Resko is really good at spotting opportunities.
Oh, he was. He saw an at a potential donor with the desire for influence. So he suggested that a generous contribution to Blagojevich's campaign could lead to a nice, cushy job in the new administration.
Hold on, basically saying, donate money, get a job.
Right.
Isn't that illegal?
Well, it's certainly ethically questionable, and it really exemplifies this culture of pay to play. That was taking root in Blagojevich's inner circle, and it wasn't just whispers and hints. The podcast describes this scene in Resko's office. That's almost too perfect. Atta walks in, hands over a $25,000 check right in front of Blagojevich, and then they proceed to discuss potential job openings. Like, Atta's not even there.
Whoa, so it's just out in the open, no subtlety at all? I mean, that's kind of brazen, isn't it?
It is, and it speaks to a sense of entitlement, a belief that they were operating above the rules. But here's where the plot thickens even further. Remember Stuart Levine, the guy connected to Blagojevich's opponent?
Yeah, the lawyer. I thought he was on the other team.
He was, but that didn't stop him from getting cozy with Resko. They both seem to thrive in that gray area where money and politics intersect. And get this, despite Blagojevich's anti-corruption campaign promises, Levine somehow managed to keep his position on some pretty important state boards after Blagojevich took office.
Okay, so he's like a double agent, working with the enemy. That's bold. What kind of boards are we talking about?
One of them was the Illinois Health Facilities Planning Board. This board basically has the power to make or break any hospital project in the state. So Levine being on it, that's a lot of influence.
I'm starting to see where this is going. Influence like that, someone's bound to try and exploit it.
Exactly, and that's precisely what happened. The podcast details how Levine attempted to extort Pam Davis, the CEO of a hospital, who was seeking approval for a major expansion project. Levine essentially told her, you want your project to get the green light, then you need to use this specific construction company.
Right, so he's holding her project hostage to benefit a particular company. What was he thinking?
Well, he was likely thinking about his own personal gain. Levine was leveraging his position on the board for financial kickbacks, taking advantage of his power to enrich himself.
So it's like a high-stakes game where the currency isn't just money, but favors and influence.
Precisely. It creates this cycle of obligation. That can be hard to break free from. But here's the twist. Pam Davis wasn't having any of it. She suspected something shady was going on. And instead of playing along, she went straight to the FBI.
Whoa, she went to the FBI. That takes guts.
Sure.
I mean, going up against a powerful figure like Levine, That's risky business.
It was a bold move. And initially, the FBI was skeptical. They figured it was just another case of political maneuvering, nothing out of the ordinary. But Davis was persistent. She knew what she'd witnessed, and she wasn't backing down.
So they finally took her seriously. What happened next?
The FBI decided to wire Davis up with a hidden microphone and send her to a meeting with Jacob Kiefelbaum. The owner of the construction company Levine was pushing. They wanted to catch him in the act.
Wait, they were recording him? Like straight out of the wire? This is getting intense.
It is. And the podcast really brings you into that moment. You can practically feel Davis's nervousness as she walks into the restaurant, adjusting the microphone, hoping Kieferbaum doesn't notice.
So what happens? Does she get the evidence she needs?
She does. Kieferbaum basically confirms what Davis suspected, saying things like, look, if you don't hire us, you'll never get this project approved. It's textbook extortion. But then, as if on cue, Stuart Levine himself walks into the restaurant.
Whoa, what a coincidence. Or maybe not so much.
Exactly. It's clear to Davis that this whole chance encounter was staged. They were trying to intimidate her. To make it clear, she had no choice but to play along. But Davis, with the FBI listening in, stays calm and eventually excuses herself, citing a fake family emergency. She walks out of that restaurant knowing she's got them, knowing she's exposed their scheme.
So she just walks out of there.
Yeah.
And she's like convinced it goes way deeper than just Levine and this construction guy. She's got this hunch that someone higher up in Blagojevich's world is pulling the strings.
And you know what? Her gut feeling was right on the money. Remember, Levine's now cooperating with the FBI, and investigators are starting to see the bigger picture. This wasn't just one isolated incident of corruption. It was a whole system, a way of doing business in Blagojevich's Illinois.
So what kind of things were they finding? What did this system actually look like?
Well, state contracts were being awarded in exchange for campaign donations, appointments to important positions. They were based on who could give the most money. It was like this giant auction, you know? And the people of Illinois, they were the ones paying the price.
Man, that's so cynical. But where does Blagojevich himself fit into all of this? Was he actively involved in these schemes? Or was he more of a hands-off leader who just kind of turned a blind eye?
That's a question that was debated throughout the whole investigation. And the trial that followed, the podcast does point out that Blagojevich seemed more concerned with his own image, with getting reelected, than with actually governing. He often worked from home or his campaign office, seeming detached from the day-to-day operations of his administration.
So he created this culture of corruption without necessarily getting his hands dirty in the details. Is that what you're saying?
It's definitely a possibility. He set the tone, fostered this environment where favors and payoffs were the norm, and then maybe he just chose to look the other way. It's tough to say for sure what was going on in his head, but the results speak for themselves.
And those results were pretty dramatic, right? I mean, a sitting governor getting arrested on federal corruption charges, that's a huge DE deal.
It was a national sensation. I mean, here was this guy who had been seen as a rising star in the Democratic Party, someone who championed progressive policies, and now he was facing serious jail time. The podcast does a great job of capturing that shock and disbelief that rippled through Illinois and beyond.
Okay, so let's talk about the evidence. What exactly did the FBI have on Blagojevich that led to his arrest?
Remember those wiretaps we talked about? They weren't just listening in on Levine and Kieferbaum. They were recording Blagojevich's phone calls, too. And those recordings became central to the case against him.
So they caught him red-handed, discussing these shady deals.
Not exactly red-handed, but the recordings painted a pretty damning picture. You could hear Blagojevich's obsession with power, with money, his willingness to use his office for personal gain, and the language he used. It was pretty shocking, coming from the governor of a state.
The podcast mentioned one recording in particular that really stood out, something about Blagojevich wanting to sell Barack Obama's Senate seat.
That's right. In one infamous recording, Blagojevich is discussing the possibility of appointing someone to Obama's vacant Senate seat in exchange for a lucrative job or a hefty campaign contribution. And he actually uses the phrase, "I've got this thing and it's fucking golden," referring to the power he had to make that appointment.
Wow, that's just brazen. It's almost hard to believe that a politician would be so careless, so blatant about his intentions.
It speaks to a certain level of arrogance, a belief that he was untouchable, maybe, or maybe he just didn't fully grasp the severity of his actions. Either way, those recordings were devastating to his defense.
So what happened in the end? Did Blagojevich actually go to prison?
He did, Blagojevich was ultimately convicted on multiple counts of corruption, including attempted extortion and wire fraud, and he was sentenced to 14 years in federal prison.
14 years. That's a long time. And it's a reminder that even those in the highest positions of power aren't above the law.
Absolutely. Blagojevich's story is a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of power and the importance of holding our elected officials accountable for their actions. It shows how ambition, unchecked and unmoored from ethical principles, can lead to a stunning fall from grace.
So where does this leave us? What are the takeaways from this deep dive into Blagojevich's world?
I think it highlights the fragility of our democratic institutions and the constant vigilance required to protect them from those who would exploit them for personal gain.
It also makes you think about the nature of power itself. Does it inherently corrupt? Or are there individuals who can wield it for good without succumbing to its temptations?
That's a question that has been debated for centuries, and there's no easy answer. But by examining cases like Blagojevich's, by understanding the factors that contribute to corruption, we can hopefully learn to safeguard against it and build a more ethical and accountable system of governance.
Well, that's a thought-provoking note to end on. I think we've all learned a lot today about power ambition and the human capacity for both good and bad. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and we'll catch you next time.